We welcome our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I am Bosin Omofaye, and this is a special edition of Your Business Morning, this New Year Day 2020. Now, one of the biggest stories of 2019 for the Nigerian authorities was World Bank Economic Update, a report produced twice a year assessing the country's recent economic and social developments, as well as prospects and policies. On December the 3rd, I sat down to a lengthy exclusive interview with the World Bank Country Director to Nigeria, Shubham Shodhuri, and the country's lead economist, Marco Hernandez. Together, we analyzed their latest report that focused on how Nigeria can leverage what it is as a country and is stepping into a new decade that starts right now.
Nigeria is having tremendous potential. You've got a young, growing population, tremendous resources, but to be entirely frank, Nigeria right now is yet to realize that potential, and that's essentially the challenge and the opportunity that we see here, that we're here to help the Nigerian government and the people work on. If I may say one thing about the World Bank, as you may know, the World Bank is actually a development cooperative, which helps its member countries, Nigeria and 188 other countries, to eliminate poverty. That's our basic mission: eliminate poverty and boost what we call shared prosperity, which means basically better jobs, better lives, better opportunities for all of its people. And we work very closely with government. All of our financing goes through the government budget. So in some sense, it's really no different from the other sources of funds that the government has. And we try to supplement that financing with close implementation support. So that's what we do all over the world, and especially here in Nigeria. Nigeria is critical to the global mission of reducing poverty.
Shubham, if you look at Nigeria's economic performance and situation vis-a-vis its contemporaries around the world, you've been a country director for the World Bank in Afghanistan and a few other countries. You have a professorship in economics. So if you look at Nigeria's, do you think this country is pulling its weight regarding vis-a-vis its resources that are available, both human and material?
At this point in time, I have to say, no, it's not. And I think that's not news to anyone here. I think I see every person I've talked to, whether in government or in civil society or academia or in the private sector, I think we all recognize Nigeria's potential and the fact that that potential is currently not being fully realized. I spent 5 years in Indonesia. I come from India myself, and Nigeria reminds me a lot of Indonesia and India in terms of the potential, which India and Indonesia are now beginning to tap into. And for Nigeria, that journey is just getting started. So in short answer to your question really is, look, Nigeria, in terms of its peers, which I would consider India, countries like India and Indonesia, in a large, multi-ethnic, robust, and perhaps noisy democracies with lots of resources, tremendous human capital, Nigeria, compared to peers like India and Indonesia, is still not quite there, but the potential is the same. And that's what we're here to help on.
Let's talk to Marco, who is the World Bank lead economist for Nigeria. Marco, you are the author of this report. So is there any difference in what is contained therein from the previous one?
So first of all, good morning to you and your viewers, and thank you for having us. So I think that in comparison to previous reports, what we see is a gradual recovery in growth in Nigeria. We're expecting growth to reach 2% in 2019 and to go up to 2.1% during 2020 to 2021. But of course, this outlook is still subject to risks, both external and domestic. On the external side, if trade disputes continue globally, or if there is a change in investor confidence that may change, the pace of global interest rates, that could affect growth. But on the opposite side, for example, higher oil prices could also boost growth in the country. But I think that most of the potential will come from what Nigeria could do domestically. So if it's accelerating the pace of structural reforms, or also, for example, increasing much needed with domestic revenue so that we can invest more in human capital, in transportation, in other infrastructure, I think that potential could increase and, of course, improve that outlook. On the other hand, of course, there are also domestic risks that some of them that have been rising, which could include the security situation, but also the pace of reforms. If that's not fast enough, then that, of course, growth may not materialize.
So if you look at the last report, because this is biannual, twice a year, have you seen any significant uptick from what the government has been doing that are incorporated in the new report over the last couple of months or so when the last report was released? Marco?
Yes, so if we compare to, for example, what has been happening in the recent months, I think there is some positive news to take into account. On the one hand side, there have been improvements in, for example, business regulations to try to move in the doing business ranking. The country was around 169th only 2 years ago, ranked in the world, and today it's 131st in the world. That could incentivize investors to come in, new firms to put the resources into the economy and, of course, grow. There has also been important signals on the trade side with the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which I think signals the potential that Nigeria has to become a leader in continental growth and integration. There are also other reforms on the digital sector and what's happening also in social protection systems to make sure that when workers are not available to find jobs, they could be having possibilities to get back in the game, so to speak. But on the other hand, there have also been news that have affected or the investor confidence, and I think that leads to the overall predictability of economic policies, for example, the recent border closures.
Okay, let's start to drill down a little bit more with the country director, Shubham. When you compare Nigeria with Indonesia and Malaysia and India and all that, you look at population here, you look at unemployment, you look at poverty. So if you put all of this together, and what do they really mean for a country such as Nigeria trying to achieve inclusive growth, trying to unlock its productive potential?
I think, Boson, the one thing, similarity also that I would stress is just the largeness of the economy and the diversity of the country. Diversity both ethnically, in terms of agroclimatic conditions, and just the state of economic development within the country. So these are challenges and as well as opportunities that both India and Indonesia have that Nigeria shares, which is, dealing with the largeness and diversity of the country. Now, in terms and population, obviously, Indonesia and Nigeria are similar. India is a bit larger. The main thing that I see in Nigeria, which reminds me of where India might have been, say, 20 years ago, at the beginning of the liberalization period, is really what government is doing or could be doing to really unlock the productive potential of private firms, entrepreneurs, young people. Right now, and some of these things, Nigeria in the last, as Marco mentioned, has done well in terms of starting to work on enabling business reforms, creating the space for businesses to establish themselves, to grow, to invest, to create jobs. And that's the kind of the main step that we see going forward, which would get Nigeria up to the kinds of growth rates that India and Indonesia have enjoyed in the last decade. I should point out that, both in India and Indonesia, this did not happen overnight. It took some time. In a large democracy like Nigeria's, like India and Indonesia's, building that consensus within the public, within different parts of the country, with different parts of the government, that we really need to focus on doing what the public sector does best, which is to create a level playing field and the space for the energy and the dynamism of the private sector to come in. I think that's really the key next step for Nigeria. Second, on domestic revenue mobilization, Nigeria does stand out in the sense that the government revenues to GDP, if you look at both at the federal level and at the level of the states, is still extremely low. It's about 8% of GDP right now, whereas in a place like India or Indonesia, you're talking closer to the higher teens, if not in the 20% of GDP. Now, why does that matter? That's because government revenues are needed to do the basic investments that only government can do, both at the state and federal level. These are investments in Nigeria's people, in basic education, in primary health care, in secondary education, in training and skills for Nigeria's burgeoning youth population, and then investments in infrastructure. So if a farmer up in Kano produces, lovely tomatoes, but they can't get to the markets in down south, or even you don't have the power to kind of have processing factories up in the north, then that full potential of Nigeria's people and resources won't be realized. So those are the two things. You need the domestic revenues so that the government can invest in people and infrastructure in a way that only government can. Everything else, leave to the dynamism of the private sector.
So, Michael, in terms of what you call national productivity here, we have one of the lowest productivity, and this was highlighted in the report that you authored, put together through various sources and all of that. So if you look at raising Nigeria's productivity level, where do you think the fault line really is here for the country?
So I think that when we talk about productivity, is first, why do we care about productivity? And I think it's because it not only can help us to boost economic growth, but also to achieve a pace of job creation that is faster, but also more inclusive. This means better paid jobs for the population. And right now, Nigeria, on its productivity levels, is hit from two sides, so to speak. On the one hand, we have lower levels of productivity when it comes to agriculture, to industry, and to services in comparison to, for example, other upper middle income countries. But in addition, we also have more people working in sectors that have lower productivity. So for example, if we take the case of agriculture, about 40% of the population in Nigeria works in agriculture. This compares to between 12 to 15% in other upper middle income countries. So the idea is how to push reforms that would help us to, first of all, make the transition of workers from agriculture towards higher services, also higher value-added services and industry as well, and also to make sure that the productivity of each one of these sectors, for example, even including in agriculture, could increase, because that would help to raise incomes, which of course will boost consumption, which will generate ideas for entrepreneurs to come into the markets, even in the digital economy, and generate a vibrant society that could not only grow faster, but more inclusively. So the areas of reforms that we highlight, I think, could be put into some buckets. On the one hand side, ensuring macroeconomic stability, a critical condition or a precondition for growth and job creation. The opportunity to invest in people, as Shubham was highlighting, critical importance to do that in Nigeria, and to do that throughout the life cycle. From the early years when you have a baby that needs to be nurtured and get into early childhood development, to getting into primary and secondary school, and even all the way up to when you're in a formal firm, and for firms to actually invest in that education as well. So that is critical. And the final point, of course, to make an enabling business environment that is suitable for investors to come in, to put resources, to risk their resources in the search for profit, and as a result, also boost job creation.
Shubham, the report released yesterday talked about needed structural reforms for Nigeria, without which the country face likely recession. Again, if you look at oil prices and what at all of that, including a number of highlighted global headwinds. So the Nigerian authorities believe that adding more debt and creating more debt to the global window is a way to go. What's your take?
I think basically it's a question of Nigeria needs additional financing. I think to do the investments, to kind of make sure that the economy is in a place to kind of be resilient to headwinds that are faced, Nigeria will need more financing. But the structural reforms that we're talking about are structural reforms that have to do with raising more revenues, improving the quality of spending. Think about every naira that the government spends and say, could it be spent better in terms of opening the space for firms, or preparing Nigeria's youth to be more productive workers and contributing to the economy. There are things which are purely macro, have to do with the macro kind of policy environment and the macro fiscal framework. Marco mentioned some of those. These are what we think of as preconditions. Now, when we talked about the risks of a potential recession, I do want to make it clear to you and your viewers that we're not saying that a recession is around the horizon. We're saying that Nigeria is in a place right now where there's lots of upside potential, but there's a vulnerability to global headwinds, as we said, in particular downward movements in oil prices. And what can Nigeria do to prepare itself? Part of what it can do, obviously, on the macro front is to ensure that the exchange rate is a bit more flexible in terms of starting to, so that you don't get stuck in a corner that many countries do, where the exchange rate is at a level which becomes unsustainable after a point. So it's a bit like a pressure cooker. A pressure cooker always has a release valve at the top, and you want to make sure that the pressure is slowly letting off, so the situation doesn't get to a point where all the pressure builds up. So on the exchange rate, that would actually help, in terms of providing some sense of, here's this kind of more stable and sustainable macro path going forward. I think the other thing on the domestic front is really thinking about how to get credit to the private sector. I think the central bank has adopted many measures to try and kind of direct lending. I think they're doing kind of the aim. Private sector needs more finance. That's clear. I think we're all clear that we need to figure out ways of getting finance. The question is, what are the ways of getting finance that are going to be more sustainable? And that really should come from the operation of the private financial sector, rather than perhaps having much more of a directed public role, because that ultimately will not be sustainable.
How do we get Nigeria this debt issue? The World Bank, the World Bank is one of the multilateral agencies. Nigeria is securing about $500 million into its power sector, for example. So Nigeria is still borrowing. So the biggest conversation on the main street right now is Nigerian authorities looking for additional $30 billion from outside the country to ramp up on infrastructure, on healthcare, on education. Some of the areas you talked about that the government needs to invest. So which way should Nigeria go here? Or do you think there are other options that the federal government can undertake without onboarding more external loans?
So I think the first thing to take into account is that the needs are vast, and of course there are different options. From the World Bank side, we work through government, so think of our resources that we provide as just an additional source of funds for the authorities. The authorities have the opportunity to mobilize their own revenues, to borrow from the commercial markets, which tend to have higher interest rates, and then to also borrow from multilaterals and other development partners like the World Bank, which tend to have longer maturities, grace periods, and of course interest rates that sometimes are closer to zero. So taking that into account, I think that when we talk about the size of the current budget in Nigeria, we see that it may not be enough to cover for all of the needs. So some of them we have been discussing already, whether it's transportation or education or health, nutrition, etc. And when we put all of those things together, we have to take into account two critical things. So on the first hand is whether a particular debt that the government is taking has the potential to boost growth, right? And in itself, of course, get the economy moving and therefore, making that debt to be sustainable over time. And on the other hand, that debt is managed very carefully. So when it comes into the type of products that the government selects, the maturities, whether it's a borrowing domestically, borrowing externally, and so forth, I think all of those options will have different balances. And this issue of the pressure cooker, not only in terms of the level of the exchange or how the exchange rate gets managed, I think it's also on the side of fiscal resources, how those resources are allocated, not only to make sure that we get the best bang for the buck for every naira that the government spends, but also when we're getting additional nairas, whether it's through debt or other means, like, for example, additional revenues, that we do so in the best possible way.
A final 30 seconds from the country director. I'm sure is going to have the last say on the show. Shubham, how do we stabilize, consolidate, and accelerate within the short to medium term? 1 minute, less than that. You have any idea for us?
I think I would stress three things. One, kind of providing policy clarity and certainty in a number of critical areas. Power is one in terms of the overall business climate, in terms of the enabling reforms, regulations in different sectors, and I would also say in terms of the cross-border trade. So I think providing the policy clarity and certainty, that's one. Second, finding ways of raising domestic revenues and initiating the necessary investments. That's the second. So those are the two things that I would stress as, and these are urgent things. They're immediate steps that can be taken. The finance bill right now, in terms of what it's doing for the VAT, et cetera, would help. In terms of debt issuance, if I may say one other thing, it's really, you want to borrow in a very transparent way for things that there will be a national consensus about, And you want to be, also look at the current budget and see, are there opportunities for redirecting spending from uses that may be suboptimal right now, are not giving you the developmental return that you'd want. So those are the two key things that we will continue to work with and support government on.
When we return, we'll look at the African Development Bank review of Nigeria's program for 5 years and the outlook for 2020 and beyond. The African Development Bank is one of Nigeria's most strategic partners when it comes to project finance and other initiative support at both the federal, subnational, and the private sector. As we were wrapping up 2019, the EFDB released a document that reviewed its engagement with Nigeria over the past 5 years. A few days after that release on December the 6th, I had an extensive one-on-one conversation with the EFDB Country Director for Nigeria, Ebrima Fall. In this first part, I focused on the 5-year program review and what had been achieved right up to the end of the 2019 fiscal year. Take a listen. When we talk about Nigeria being the largest shareholder in EFDB, what is the size and value of Nigeria's shareholding in the EFDB group?
Nigeria is the largest shareholder with a 9.4% shareholding in the African Development Bank. It is followed by the United States. In most other institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the US is usually the largest shareholder. But Nigeria, in the case of our bank, is the largest shareholder with 9.4%.
And dollar value?
Well, the dollar value in terms of last year's, the last GCI contribution was about $310 million of paid up capital, although there is also the unpaid capital subscription. In terms of the paid up capital, is about $306 million as of December. And when you take that and factor it with the amount of lending that we do in Nigeria, we're able to leverage for each dollar that Nigeria contributes about $17, $18 to that. So it's quite a significant leverage for the contributions that they make.
Great. With that background, now let's talk about the snapshot. Give us the snapshot of your AFDB Nigeria's operation in the country over the last 4-year period, or so 2013 to 2019. That's about a 6-7 year.
Yeah, so from 2012 to 2019, the current country strategy, which ends at the end of this month, we were able to implement or invest in Nigeria directly about $3.2 billion. And then we were able to then leverage other partners to join us in financing investments to the total tune of about $5.3 billion in many sectors of the economy, private sector and public.
Great. So if you look at the total investments, how did it all go? How is it spread between the sovereign and the subnationals and perhaps the private sector?
Yeah, generally, we have a ratio of 50% sovereign and 50% private sector. Of course, it's a dynamic ratio in the sense that depending on new approvals and projects that are ending, the ratio might be tilted somewhat toward either public or private, depending on the time of that we're looking at it. But generally, we target a 50-50 balance in terms of our distribution. In terms of the federal and the states, these two changes, but generally the federal allocation is slightly higher, definitely, than the states. We're now expanding our subnational strategy, developing capacities of the states to implement projects. That is critically important if we want to scale up in the subnational space.
So you sat down with your team and some government officials, and I think it's very big stakeholders. If you check on Twitter, what your office tweeted this week in terms of country performance review. What's the outcome of this review?
Yeah, so at the end of every 5-year cycle, because the strategy papers are 5-year cycles, so at the end of each cycle, we do 2 reports. The first one is what's called the country portfolio performance review, where we take stock at what projects, what we had planned to do and what projects were implemented, and to then assess how well really we have worked to implement what we say we were going to do. The idea is to make sure that we had value for money, that impact is being felt, etc. So that was one part of the process. The second part of the process was to inform stakeholders what we have been discussing with the government over the past year in terms of what the new strategy going forward from 2020 to 2024 is going to be. So that was the purpose of the consultations and the validation exercise this week.
So let's do sectoral distribution of these $5.3 billion between 2013 and 2019. What sectors top the list of your performance of EFDB in Nigeria, and why?
The financial sector is the largest, and the financial sector really, we're talking the private sector. As you know, the bank is a wholesale lender. We do not do retail banking. But to be able to lend to the most important segment of the private sector, which is the small and medium scale enterprises, we operate through lending to the commercial banks at the wholesale level. So we provide lines of credit, and this is then on lend to the small, medium scale operators. We also provide lending for real sector activity. So that green portion that you're seeing on the screen of 41% comprises all our private sector lending, but mostly comprising wholesale lending to banks for onward lending to small, medium scale enterprises. Then, of course, you have the energy sector, which is also extremely important, followed by water and sanitation and other segments. Agriculture is about 9%, but we are looking to scale that up in the new CSP to about 20 to 25% of our portfolio.
What informed this sectoral distribution of your operations in terms of dollars infusion into them? Is it based on the requests from government or private sector or subnationals? How do you decide what projects get what?
Well, essentially, the whole process is always demand-driven by the government. Our strategy is based completely on the government's medium-term or long-term strategy and what the government prioritizes. What we do is to accompany the government, to partner with them, to invest in areas that we receive requests from. That's one. The second thing is the level of preparedness of projects. So different sectors are at a different level of preparedness. And what we find is that we could improve the state of readiness of projects in many of the other sectors. Of course, there's also the urgency of infrastructure, which is undeniable. So these are areas that I think the last pillars of the CSP focused on. The first pillar was on social inclusion, and the second pillar on social inclusion and sector policy, and the second pillar was on infrastructure again. And I think the new pillars are also going to emphasize some aspects of that.
Okay, so in part of your contributions to Nigeria, I'm sure folks are interested in power and energy and agriculture. Can you speak to this both at the national level and at the state level, what's been achieved over the 2013-2019 period? Mr. Fall?
Yes, in the power sector, we have been working very closely with the government, and of course contributing significantly to the PRSP process through providing guarantees to independent power producers. We just recently, last week, approved a $210 million loan to the TCN for transmission. That was a stage one project. We expect to move on to stage two, which will again cover probably about another 100 million. The idea is to improve the transmission and the evacuation of power, of idle power, for example, estimated to be around 3,000 megawatts that is presently not being evacuated, so that this project will aim to help that. We also have received and are working with the government to see how we can help to improve the discourse. So that's another critical element of the power sector that we're working on. But in the private space, the independent power producers, there's a lot of clean energy projects that the bank is looking to support and to also provide guarantees to investors in that space.
Very interesting, a table, a chart that's on the TV screen now for our viewers to see the map of Nigeria and the footprints of EFDB Nigeria across those 5 pillars at the bottom right of the screen. So if you look at this distribution of these ongoing projects, do you think this is sufficiently covered if you look at what has been achieved between 2013 and 2017, if you're looking at the chart at the upper left of the TV screen there, that graph?
Yes, this shows the bank's footprint in Nigeria, sort of based on the 5 priorities of the bank, essentially power, agriculture, industrialization, improving quality of life, and regional integration. You're absolutely right. The bottom right there clearly is more densely sort of covered, but that's not surprising. I mean, if you look at Lagos as the largest, Lagos State, for example, as the largest economy within Nigeria itself, you will definitely see some bias towards that. But I think more importantly also, there are other factors that makes it difficult sometimes to operate in certain areas of the country. But it doesn't prevent us from doing that, but it just means that the scope and scale of operations tends to be much smaller in some of those areas. We are very conscious of the need to ensure that there's a distribution between the 6 regions is even. So we aim to make sure that there's an even distribution across all the 6 regions of the country.
So you sat down this week with some government officials and all. I'm sure you've continued to have this engagement. What are the lessons learned and what recommendations are on the table from the 2013-2019 CPPR?
Yeah, I think there are lessons for both sides of this partnership. If I start maybe with us, the bank itself, one of the things that we have learned, and I think you will agree, is that we have scaled up our operations significantly since 2016. We have almost doubled the size of the staffing in Nigeria, and that shows that we want to be close to the operations and to understand and to also partner with the government. We also, the second lesson also would be that preparation, in most cases, the money to invest is not the problem, but the preparation of the projects to bring them to bankability is a challenge. So there's a need to make sure that adequate project preparation is being done across the federal government and also across the states. The third area is that the project implementation units tend to lack capacity in implementing projects, which can lead to delays. So what we are doing to mitigate that is with our presence now on the ground, we can meet with the project implementation units very often, more often than we could have if we are not fully equipped on the ground. So that is also helping the process of implementing projects in Nigeria. Other delays, other things that we're discussing with the government are more procedural and process-driven. For example, once projects are approved, they have to go through the FEC and also through the Attorney General, and that sometimes could take some time. So we're looking at ways of how to make that process a little more smoother than it is right now.
Great. So let's talk about the future. The 2020-2024 country strategy paper for Nigeria. What's in this document and what will make it significantly different or be a game changer for the country?
Yeah, this is a very important strategy for us because I think it is the first strategy since we have scaled up in country. The focus, the two pillars that we have been discussing with government are anchored by the ERGP and also forward-looking in the sense that we are anticipating some of the things that the 11 points priorities that the government is pushing towards a medium-term strategy going forward. So it's going to be based on two pillars. The first pillar is on infrastructure and sector governance. And the second pillar is social inclusion through agribusiness and human capital development. And these are areas that the government have prioritized that we have discussed with them that our interventions will be governed by these two pillars. We expect that over the next 5 years, we would be investing at least about $1 billion a year directly, but leveraging from our partners probably an equal amount at least to be able to invest in all of the sectors that we hope to be in, that we are in already, but to scale up in many areas. One area that we want to really expand significantly is agriculture. So based on the special agro-processing zone model that we have started developing in other areas, we intend to intensify our engagement both at the federal and the state level to scale up on SAPCs. We expect to continue our investments in the power sector. We expect to invest a lot more in water and sanitation, but of course, roads and other infrastructure as well. This time around, though, aside from just the physical infrastructure, we are focusing a lot on the human capital investments, on creating jobs, on health, on nutrition, etc. These are all important aspects of the new strategy.
Well, the government's planning to borrow more. That's the Nigerian sovereign. The authorities, the government is planning to borrow at least about additional $22 billion more, which has been presented to the National Assembly. And some of the, if you look at the breakdown of the project, some of them, these monies will be borrowed from the EFDB. Do they fall under this 2020-2024 program you're talking about, Mr. Fall?
Yes, every borrowing has to fall within the framework that's currently in place. This new strategy we expect will be approved by our board sometime in February, and that is enough time for us to be able to work on the projects that are falling in the first quarter of the year. So yes, they will fall within this strategy.
My conversation with AFDB's Ebrima File continues after this break. Moving forward in this final part of the AFDB's Ebrima File exclusive, I was interested in the outlook for Nigeria as 2020 starts right now. does your program moving forward fit into Nigeria's broader economic outlook?
Well, I think it is supportive of the government and the private sector. We're a bit more, I think, positive, given what we're seeing. For example, we're seeing a greater momentum in investing in infrastructure, both in the public and the private space. We're seeing more public-private investments that are developing. We just had the Africa Investment Forum in Johannesburg, and the response to Nigeria was significant. And we are looking ourselves at several projects with private sector donors. So we believe that although our Africa Economic Outlook will not come out until probably towards the end of January, we are seeing we anticipate some incremental growth in the economy going forward. Probably not as large as one would like to see, but definitely we can understand the sentiment that is expressed by Moody's, giving some of the more global risk that Nigeria faces, both in terms of oil prices, for example, and probably interest rates. But I think that from a domestic investment point of view, infrastructure will play a big part. But agriculture, more agro-based processing, I think also will add to the momentum, and manufacturing will add to the momentum to generate some incremental growth going forward.
If you try to weigh your investments in the country in terms of the critical areas that you mentioned in the first part of this interview, which has to do with the Human Development Index and Human Capital Index, both indices, one by the UNDP
Yes.
and the other by the World Bank. Moving forward, how do you think we will rank moving forward? If you look at some of the concerns regarding the fact that Nigeria may hold the largest portion of the world's poor in some decades down the line.
Yeah, I mean, indices hide some very significant facts. Our own strength in terms of partnering with the government in human capital will focus on basically skills, TVET programs, and STEM. We're also focusing on health, and like I said, to try to help also prevent stunting, nutritional aspects of things. Some of our partners, the UN, the World Bank, etc., focus in other areas, in addition to maybe some of the areas that we're also doing in terms of primary education, early child education, etc. The index takes all of that and more, so it's very difficult to say which way the index will go. But we are seeing that the government itself has prioritized human capital as the main priority of this government going forward. We are seeing larger partnerships also, not only with the donor community, with the development partner community, but we are seeing it with private entities like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I think the drive towards improving human capital investments and outcomes in the country has picked up significant momentum. And I would expect that the indices that we're talking about will improve going forward.
On a final note, if we go back to portfolio investment, strategic thrust, what will be the change of tack or tactics, if you want to put it that way, moving forward in some of the lessons that you learned from the 2013-2019 program on the side of the government, both at the sovereign and the subnational level?
I think at the sovereign level, power is going to continue to be critical. Water and sanitation projects are going to be critical at the sovereign level. And of course, human capital investments are going to be critical. What we're seeing now in the non-sovereign, we're trying to sort of rebalance our portfolio away from wholesale lending through lines of credits to more real investments. For example, on agro-based processing. So we look at the whole value chain for agriculture and try to promote more value addition in those sectors through manufacturing activities or some other added value-added activities in those sectors. For example, in the last ESP, we are also financing, part of the financing team for the Dangote refinery. We finance also the Indorama fertilizer project in the private sector. We are now looking next year to be part of the team financing the Lagos cable car project, for example, which I believe is a very transformative project. We are looking at financing some economic cities in the Njimba, in Abia, for example. So these are all very, very important and transformative projects that the bank is working on, not only in the public space, but also in the private sector, with a deliberate attempt to move our portfolio from wholesale lending to actual real sector investments.
That extensive conversation with the country director of EFDB Nigeria, Ebrima Fal, giving us an outlook into 2020-2024 program of the EFDB engagement with Nigeria. Of course, the new year 2020 will prove to be a new year for Nigeria in many respects. It will be new in the sense of the various internal and external challenges and opportunities the country face. What will make the difference, however, is how Nigeria responds and positions itself for the new decade that starts today. The real work starts tomorrow, Thursday, January the 2nd. So let's get started. Ahead of that, United Capital, one of the investment banks listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, released Nigeria Economic Outlook for 2020 and says the government or the Nigeria really needs what it calls a coordinated and coherent policy framework. What that means in terms of the macroeconomic policy, monetary policy, the stock market, fixed income space, and capital inflows for the economy, all that will be analyzed from tomorrow moving forward. I am Bosin Namafai, and I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, and goodbye from Lagos.